Hey guys, Spencer Young here to talk with you about the implications for us as a group of Daniel Bell's book, Just War as Christian Discipleship. Joshua did a great job going over the major points of the book, so I'm not going to reiterate those here, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the points that really stood out to me for our reflection as a group. I think the idea that by far stood out the most to me is this contrast that Bell makes between just war as Christian discipleship and just war as we practice it in public policy today. In the former view, God is in control of everything. Nothing and no one surprises him, right? You want to prove this to yourself, just go and throw God a surprise party. Try it. Let me know how it goes. But in the latter view, we're sort of on our own. Victory or loss in battle is merely the product of chance. I've mentioned this in some of our forum discussions, but for those of you who didn't catch that, I'm also a law and business student at the University of Utah, in addition to my work at Fuller. And back in the summer of 2014, I worked on a research project for one of my professors delving into the rules of jury selection. Long story short, in the days of yore, people used to resolve conflicts and questions of guilt in a number of different ways, including in one way they would have the suspect carry a red hot stick of iron for a set distance, and then afterward they'd wrap his hands in bandages, and if in 3 days the bandages were the wounds were healed, he was presumed innocent. They'd have lancing, and for clergy they would actually eat a morsel of bread. You can think back to the Old Testament where a woman who was suspected of adultery would have to eat, I can't remember what exactly it was, and depending on the result of the digestion, that would determine their guilt or innocence. And we sort of see these things as primitive in our Western context, but the belief was that God was in control and would evidence the guilt of the culpable party in the result of these trials. In the same way, countries used to fight wars believing that whoever prevailed was the country that was right in God's eyes, because God was in control. But in 1215, Pope Innocent III declared many of these ways of resolving individual guilt to be invalid. Essentially what he did is forbade clergy from participating in them, and the only means of resolving guilt that was left was the primitive form of what would become our jury. Nevertheless, I think that moment in 1215 was a turning point for Western culture, away, or at least for the Western legal system, away from a faith, a robust faith that God is in control, that God determines outcomes regardless of human choices. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to having like murder suspects walk on hot coals or having like lancing matches out in the street, although that would be kind of fun. But I do think we've succumbed to a form of rationalism that runs away from a God who's big enough to affect outcomes in spite of human choices. I think for us today, the biggest way in which just war as Christian discipleship speaks into our lives is in our politics. The church, or at least a very large part of the church, far from being removed from politics, tends to involve itself very heavily with the Republican Party. We have politicians and presidents who claim the name of Jesus going on TV and in special addresses, inciting fear among the masses to pound the war drums because they don't believe that God is in control. If God's in control, there's no room for fear as a motive for war. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, many Muslims in America experienced widespread acts of hate, and I believe it is because of the rhetoric of fear that our politicians used, many of them claiming the name of Jesus, to drive us into Afghanistan and then into Iraq. As a result, we ended up hating people who aren't even our enemies. We are commanded to love people to love our enemies, and Bell talks about this in the book quite a bit. But when we don't believe that God's in control and we believe that it's all on us, we end up really hating our enemies. And even in the case of the September 11th attacks, people who aren't our enemies. And so I think if the church is to reclaim the just war tradition as a means of Christian discipleship, it starts by removing ourselves from the political fray. Jesus is not right-wing or left-wing. He's a whole other bird. Ecclesiastes 7:18 says this: "It's best to stay in touch with both sides of an issue. A person who fears God deals responsibly with all of reality, not just a piece of it." I think the church needs to start living like that. We need to start living like Jesus is not right-wing or left-wing. We need to start living above the political fray. Today we have people who are Christians because they're Republicans, What we need is people who are Republicans or Democrats because they're Christians. We need people who see politics and the affairs of the state through the lens of their faith, instead of people who see their faith through the lens of their politics. Thank you.